A teenager handed over some jewelry on September 4th, 476 AD, and in that single quiet moment, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist. No siege, no final battle. One of the most powerful states in human history ended with what amounts to a shrug. So how exactly does the greatest empire the Western world has ever seen just collapse like that? That teenager with the jewelry, his name was Romulus Augustulus, and the name alone should tell you something. Romulus, after the legendary founder of Rome. Augustulus, a diminutive of Augustus, the greatest emperor who ever lived. His father apparently had ambitions. History, as it turned out, had other plans. Romulus wasn't emperor because he'd earned it. He was emperor because his father, a military strongman named Orestes, had seized control of the Western court less than a year earlier and needed a figurehead on the throne. Someone pliable, someone young, someone who wouldn't get in the way. Romulus was all three. He was, by most accounts, still a teenager. The actual power sat with Orestes. The boy in the purple robe was essentially a prop, which makes what happened on September 4th, 476, considerably less dramatic than it sounds. The man who came to collect that jewelry was Odoacer, a Germanic military commander who had spent years leading foederati troops in service of the Western Empire. Foederati, if you're not familiar, were essentially allied barbarian units that Rome had been hiring to do its fighting for it. Because by the mid-5th century, the empire could no longer field a Roman army in any meaningful sense. Odoacer wasn't an invader who had crossed the frontier to sack the capital. He was already on the payroll. He had been fighting for Rome. The man who ended the Western Roman Empire was, technically, a Roman military employee. When Orestes refused to grant Odoacer's troops the land settlements they'd been promised, land in Italy, a reasonable enough request from soldiers who had just been doing Rome's fighting, Odoacer revolted. He defeated and killed Orestes within days. Then he turned his attention to the boy on the throne. And here is where the story quietly refuses to be dramatic. Odoacer summoned Romulus, accepted the surrender of the imperial regalia, the diadem, the purple robe, the symbols of Western Roman authority, and then, in a move that tells you everything about how seriously anyone took this particular emperor, he simply let the boy go. No execution, no imprisonment. Romulus was pensioned off to a comfortable villa in Campania, in southern Italy, with a generous annual allowance. The last emperor of the Western Roman Empire was sent to live out his days in what was essentially a very nice retirement. Odoacer then packaged up the imperial regalia and sent them east to Constantinople, along with a letter to the Eastern Emperor Zeno. The message, stripped of its diplomatic language, amounted to this: the West doesn't need its own emperor anymore. Odoacer would govern Italy as king, nominally under Eastern authority. One emperor for the whole Roman world was plenty. Think about what that actually was in administrative terms. It wasn't a conquest. It wasn't a revolution. It was closer to a corporate restructuring, a regional office informing headquarters that it was dissolving itself and would henceforth report directly to the top. The paperwork was filed. The transfer was complete. The Western Roman Empire ceased to exist, not with a siege, but with a memo. And here's the detail worth holding on to as we push forward. Zeno, sitting in Constantinople, received that letter and was, and this is the important part, not particularly alarmed. He had concerns, certainly, but the sky had not fallen in the east. The Roman Empire, from his perspective, was still very much open for business, which raises the question this whole story is really building toward. If the deposition was this quiet, and Constantinople barely flinched, then why do we call it a fall at all? And what does that word cost us in actually understanding what happened? Odoacer pensioned off the last Western emperor instead of executing him. So which move do you think actually showed more power? The sword or the retirement villa? Drop your answer in the comments below. Because what happened next reveals why even the people living through this barely knew an empire had just ended. And that letter to Constantinople is exactly where the story gets genuinely strange, because Zeno's response tells you more about the fall of Rome than the deposition itself ever could. Zeno didn't declare a national emergency. He didn't dispatch a fleet. He wrote back, acknowledged Odoacer's authority over Italy, and more or less moved on with his day. From Constantinople's perspective, this was administratively tidy. The Roman Empire hadn't fallen. One half of it had quietly folded into the other. The Eastern Court still called itself Roman, still ran Roman law, still collected Roman taxes, and would continue doing so for nearly another 1,000 years. To Zeno, September 4th, 476 was not a catastrophe. It was a reorganization, which means the real question isn't what happened on that day. It's why the day existed at all. And for that, you have to pull the camera back considerably further. The Western Empire hadn't collapsed in 476. It had been collapsing in slow motion for at least a century before Romulus ever sat on that throne. Tax revenue had been hemorrhaging for decades, partly because the territories that generated it kept slipping out of Roman control. Gaul, roughly modern France, had been dominated by the Visigoths for years. Spain was Visigothic territory. North Africa, the breadbasket that fed the city of Rome, had been in Vandal hands since the 430s. By the time Odoacer revolted, the Western Empire's tax base was essentially Italy and not much else. An empire running on Italy's revenue alone is not really an empire. It's a peninsula with delusions. The army had hollowed out in parallel. The foederati, those Germanic allied units, the same category of soldier Odoacer himself commanded, had become the Western military in all but name. The problem with an army made entirely of foederati is that their loyalty ran to their commanders, not to Rome. When Orestes refused to pay them in land, they didn't petition the Senate. They picked a new general and revolted. The institution that was supposed to defend the empire was the same institution that ended it. And the reason is simply that the empire had stopped being able to afford a real army decades earlier. Here is the irony that the history books don't always linger on. Odoacer, the man who formally ended the Western Roman Empire, had absolutely no interest in destroying Roman civilization. He kept the Roman Senate. He kept Roman law. He kept the tax system, the administrative apparatus, the roads, the courts, all of it, largely intact, because those structures were how he governed and how he got paid. The Germanic commanders who supposedly brought Rome down were, in many cases, the most enthusiastic preservers of Roman institutional life, because Rome's bureaucratic machinery was the only thing that made ruling a complex territory manageable. They didn't tear the system down. They moved into it. And that is why, the morning after Romulus handed over the regalia, most people living in the former Western Empire experienced absolutely nothing. The tax collector still came. The local magistrate still held court. The roads were the same roads. The laws were the same laws. The vast majority of people living through the fall of Rome didn't experience a fall. They experienced a Tuesday. That's what makes 476 AD genuinely haunting. Not the drama of it, but the absence of drama. The Western Roman Empire ended not because it was defeated, but because by the time it was officially over, there was almost nothing left to end. The last 24 hours of Rome weren't a last stand. They were a formality. And the most powerful civilization the Western world had ever produced didn't go out with a siege or a battle cry. It went out with a letter, a pension, and a very quiet Tuesday morning. Subscribe if you want more history that actually explains the why, not just what happened, but why it mattered, and watch the next video on screen.